I wish to speak a word for Yu-Gi-Oh! For absolute freedom and design decisions as contrasted with the design ethos merely technical. To regard duelists as an inhabitant or a part and parcel of our game, rather than a mere participant. I wish to make an extreme statement, if so, I may make an emphatic one, for there are enough champions of set rotation. The Bussy and the Joel and every one of you will take care of that. There's been a lot of talk in the community lately about set rotation and Yu-Gi-Oh! What it might mean for the game should it ever be introduced, what it's done for the other major card games, and the unique design elements to our game that make it more difficult to conceptualize and implement. Recently, attempts have been made to introduce something akin to a rotation format, and to me, this was the last straw that necessitated making a video on the subject. Before we begin, it might be helpful to define our terms quickly. Set rotation in card games is a system by which cards and sets get taken out of the game at predetermined times. Essentially, the only cards legal for play in a competitive environment are those released within a set window. Everything before then is essentially banned. For comparison, in Yu-Gi-Oh!, a game with no set rotation, every single card that is not on the forbidden list is playable in Yu-Gi-Oh!'s main competitive format. Yu-Gi-Oh!'s lack of a set rotation, a gameplay element I will refer to hereafter as an open format, carries with it many upsides and downsides, and while many believe that the upsides would far outweigh the down, I unfortunately stand opposed to that idea. Yu-Gi-Oh! Opinions tend to move like waves, and once an opinion has caught the wind, it quickly becomes canon law. Playability of certain techs, the power level of a new or old deck, combo lines, we in the community are quick to label and define and come to conclusions. Time-Rending Morganite will change the game forever, until it doesn't. Amazing Defenders was a worthless set, until it wasn't. Ultimate Slayer could be the next big staple, until it isn't. Occasionally, it is necessary to take a step back and play the devil's advocate. Now let's advocate for some devils. I think it goes without saying that archetypes are a uniquely Yu-Gi-Oh! Design element. Magic has synergistic deck design, don't get me wrong. Creatures with similar types and colors can work together to form cohesive strategies, but the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game is different. Cards belonging to an archetype share the same naming convention and are designed to work with each other, often sharing complementary effects, themes, visual and gameplay aesthetics. A Yu-Gi-Oh! Archetype is more than just a collection of cards. It's a narrative shorthand for a player or character's personality. While some have suggested keeping a core set of relevant or classic archetypes to help combat this problem, the core issue remains. What you consider to be pack filler is somebody else's favorite archetype or playstyle. There isn't a way to curate a modern rotation format without eliminating the very reason why a sizable chunk of the player base plays the game in the first place. It might seem silly to allow anime fans and nostalgia-blinded players to dictate the health of the modern competitive format, but as long as we're pretending that the issue at hand is bringing new players on board and not eliminating corner cases that old techs might enable, rotating prediction princesses might well do more harm for the well-being of the game than getting a card like Mushroom Man number 2 out of the way ever could help. While we're on the subject of prediction princesses, let's talk about legacy support, the big elephant in the room that could stand to be contextualized and justified. Closely tied to the previous point about archetypes, but different from both a business and player perspective. Legacy support is Konami's lifeblood and this is pure conjecture, likely a larger contributor to old players returning to the game than any other factor. Could you imagine a more radical design shift than going from releasing waves of support meant to bring old beloved archetypes closer in line with modern design decisions to eliminating those archetypes from the game completely through rotation? I've heard it said that archetypes could be reintroduced into the game whole cloth when their new support is introduced. Marincess receives a new card, and now the whole archetype is brought back into the game at low rarity, allowing the deck to be rebuilt. But what a clumsy and clogged strategy, greatly restricting the ability of Konami to create new cards in that set, necessitating more sets, or some type of clause in the rotation that allows members of that archetype to be played when the new support is released. This, of course, doesn't even mention cards that aren't members of the archetype exactly, but were crucial elements of that deck's end board or game plan. F-Zero isn't a ghost trick monster, but it's close enough. So, old decks receive new support and get brought into the game again. Easy, you might say, but at what rarity? It's been a decade since that Fire Fist card was printed. How are they going to bring it back? And for that matter, what about Ash Blossom, or Imperm, or any number of the generic spells or traps that we've come to consider staples? Looks like Twin Twister got rotated out again, better hope Konami includes it. For a player base that considers Konami the true final boss, our Xemnas if you will, we're certainly offering them quite a lot of power to reintroduce and control how we play cards of old. It's entirely possible that reprinting cards back into the format would allow the old printings to become legal once again, but for a company that has printed so many versions of Monster Reborn it isn't funny anymore, are we willing to risk that? A common criticism of Yu-Gi-Oh's open format is that cards designed by people who are now dead clash against design decisions made in the present day, allowing cards like number 89 to see meta contention so significant that it eventually gets banned, or Totally Awesome brought back to such relevance through Sprite that it led to the engine getting hit. This necessitates a few answers. Firstly, it's important to remember that the new cards, Arise Heart and Sprite Elf, if we're continuing this example, were the straws that broke the camel's back in these instances, and it's difficult to place the blame, if you will, on the old or new cards. Is Kashtira overpowered because of the interactions number 89 enabled, or because it allows you to extend for an eternity without normal summoning? And while we're on the subject of Kashtira, is it annoying that an ancient card like the aforementioned Mushroom Man number 2 can prove a thorn in the deck's side? Or is that fantastic and awesome and something that we want to preserve? For every degenerate piece of cardboard that facilitates something stupid in a modern deck, old and dusty texts rise up and become playable in a way that makes the theory crafting and experimentation of this game something fascinating to witness. Formats come and go, but the band played on. Let's address the notion of simplifying the game for a moment. Now, I don't want to accuse anybody of concern trolling, but the amount of times I've heard that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is too complicated for new players in one breath, followed by explaining that Konami could easily create a comprehensive Yu-Gi-Oh! Rulebook because Magic the Gathering has one and it's much more complicated in the next breath is frustrating beyond comprehension. Players aren't not joining our game because it's too complicated. Players aren't joining our game because card games aren't and never will be mainstream, and the popularity of video games that are much more entertaining for spectators to follow will perpetually keep it that way. Yu-Gi-Oh! Takes as long to get a solid grasp on as Pokemon, or Magic the Gathering, or League of Legends, or woodworking. Hobbies take investment, and people who are interested will make that investment. If anything, the idea of comprehensively codifying rules will have a greater impact on simplifying the game than rotating out old cards ever will. New players won't care one iota that Salamandrate is no longer playable. Old players certainly will. And I find it far more likely that you lose more players cutting out old cards than you will ever hope to gain. I don't mean for this to come across too aggressive or know-it-all-ish. Believe me, that isn't the purpose of this. I just hear quite a lot of talk very confidently pointed in one direction and strongly believe the opposite position. This, combined with the frequency in which these same platforms seek to disparage our collective hobby by other means, forces me to question their motives. Do we love this game or not? Why are we all here? Is this something that could be solved with a more responsive and flexible banless policy change? What actually annoys us here? I don't want to pretend that I have all the answers, and in that way at least, I hope to distinguish myself. Thanks for listening to me. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you disagree or have any comments or criticisms, please leave them below. Obviously, this isn't comprehensive, but I feel like it's a good introduction to my perspective. Have a nice day. Wash behind your ears.